Hey everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California, and currently trying to swim through the brain fog of quarantine day 356 to do any kind of meaningful work today. I've done a little. I've read. You know what? It's been an exhausting week. My dear dog Mabel had surgery on, was it Monday, Tuesday? I don't even know anymore. This quarantine brain fog is real, folks. I said, I tweeted last night. God, I feel like regaling people with a tweet of yours is the same kind of feeling as telling someone about a dream or an improv scene you were in, but I think it stands. I tweeted last night how in quarantine, the amount of energy that it takes to do a simple task like, say, clean the litter box in earlier times would be equal to the amount of energy it took to create Stonehenge or agitate for the 8-hour workday or ending child labor. Oh boy. But I'm very excited about today's episode. This is Bobby Previte. I recorded this one back in the end of October last year. There were a couple sound issues that I had to deal with, which is why I'm putting it out now. I had to find the time to do that. But this is honestly one of my favorite interviews that I've done. By the way, if you don't know who Bobby Previte is, why don't I read you his bio right now? Originally from Niagara Falls, New York, drummer and composer Bobby Previte was one of the seminal figures of the 1980s New York downtown scene that included John Zorn, Wayne Horvitz, and Elliott Sharp. And his original compositions have been recorded and released on labels like Sony, Elektra, Sodic, and many others. He's also led a plethora of diverse ensembles from behind his drums and has collaborated with many of the leading lights in and beyond the world of music, including master composer John Adams, iconic singer Tom Waits, Pantheon filmmaker Robert Altman, and most recently, rock legend Iggy Pop. He's also the recipient of the 2015 Greenfield Prize for Music and was a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow in 2012. And his latest albums are a series of live recordings called Ground Truther, which you can get on his Bandcamp site now. I cannot recommend his music enough. I first discovered Bobby's compositions. It feels weird for me to say Bobby, by the way. It feels a little too familiar. But I first heard the 23 Constellations of Juan Moreau. I don't know how to pronounce that artist. It's an artist I love, and yet I have a terrible American way of saying everything. Joan Moreau? Anyway, his composition, the 23 Constellations of Joan Moreau. Oh boy. I think back in college, and since then I just fall in love with everything he's done. And I really didn't know much about him, and I was really excited that he agreed to do the show. But I quickly found out not only is his childhood fascinating, but he's also an incredibly smart and affable guy to talk to. You know, when we were done, I thought I could probably talk to him about anything for an hour and it'd be a fun conversation. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Even if you don't know who Bobby Previte is, I think it is you'll quickly find he's a charming individual, and you will enjoy the next hour of your life. By the way, if this is your first time listening to Beginnings, thank you for checking out the show. Been doing it for 11 years, and what I like to do up top is recommend some episodes for new listeners based on who the guest is. Now, Bobby is, I would say, on the, let's call it the weirder side, or the more experimental side of music. And I've talked to a number of people who play in the same sandbox Bobby does. Arto Lindsay, for example. David Harrington of Kronos Quartet. Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. Just talked to him a little while ago. So check out those episodes. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the show. I've talked to hundreds of really interesting people from every walk of creative life, including TV writers and authors and musicians and artists, comedians, performers, and so on and so forth. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, on Stitcher, Spotify, Google, Amazon. I guess that's another place that's trying to do podcasts now. And you can find me on social media at Andy Beckerman on both Instagram and Twitter. A lot of great, amazing episodes coming up. Next week, Sarah Mary Chadwick, who's an amazing songwriter from New Zealand, now lives in Australia. I've got both Clay and Matt from Chavez coming up. Jamie Stewart of Shoo Shoo. That was really wonderful. Bob Nastanovich from Pavement. Oh, Peggy Seeger, who is Pete Seeger's half-sister and a fantastic musician in her own right. Very interesting person. So stay tuned for all of those. But for now, let's talk to Bobby.
Hey.
I'm really excited to talk to you. I mean, there's a number of things. One of them is that you grew up in Niagara Falls, which I only know as a tourist destination, and I'm really curious about what it was like to grow up there.
Oh boy. that you have no idea what you just asked, but but yeah, we could talk about that for sure. The short answer is bizarre.
Do you? Well, okay. Well, let me just run with that for a second. Then, do you think that contributed in any way to who you are as a person? Because I've talked to people on the show before who grew up in like Downey, California, which is like one of the strangest places, and it's just like giant tracts of like they're of abandoned homes because they were gonna build a giant highway through it, and then they stopped, and so it's just like a bunch of abandoned homes, and there were like some of the like weirdest, like I think the guy who created the X-Files is from there, and the people who are from there said that like, yes, that's made me kind of a weird person. So did Niagara Falls shape you like that?
Make me a weird person? I'm sure that it has shaped me in many ways. I mean, Niagara Falls, where do I begin? I mean, I started to write like a kind of an opera or a piece about it. I did a work in progress of this piece with the director Daniel Fish. You know him? He did the New Oklahoma on Broadway. He's brilliant, but I mean, he does his own things, which are really great. He did something about Chelsea Manning called The Source. And anyway, I did a piece about Niagara Falls. We did it up here in Hudson, where I have a house at the Hudson Opera House. Niagara Falls, God, it's so hard to even. There's a book by Ginger Strand called Niagara, Truth and Lies. And I think if you're really interested after this conversation, you should read that book because it's a great book. And, I grew up, Niagara Falls is it was a very Italian town. It's a very provincial town, yet at the falls themselves is, the whole world comes, right? So it was this strange schizophrenic town where if you were around the falls, you'd see people with turbans and, like people from everywhere, dashikis and all over the world. Everyone knows Niagara Falls, but no one knows anything really about Niagara Falls, because in the town it was so conservative and provincial and, kind of repressive. I was kind of, I mean, I didn't feel those things when I was young, but I don't think, but I sure do now. I realize how crazy it was. Not to mention, there's many things about Niagara Falls. Of course, you know about the falls, which is the eighth wonder of the world or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. But, there's a lot of, and we used to go down there, of course, as kids, and we played all these weird games. Like one game was, there's the rapids, which is the water that goes over Niagara Falls, and you can go to an island there, and you can literally be right on the shore of the water that goes to Niagara Falls, over Niagara Falls, and you can go all the way close to the falls to where it's called the, quote, point of no return. Whereas if you go in the water, you're going over. There's no possibility of not going over. And we would play this game where we would put a foot in, and then the next person would have to put a foot a little farther, and then the next put a little farther, until, somebody decided, okay, that's the end of that game. We would do things like that. Or we would go, there's a place you can go called the Cave of the Winds. And for many years, that was my publishing company, where you go beneath the falls. You're literally behind the falls in some instances, but you can go really close to the bottom of the falls. You can't even do this stuff anymore because it's too dangerous. And we play a game. Okay, we would have a stopwatch, and we would say, "Okay, ready?" And each of us in turn would look up at the brink of the falls with your eyes open, and we would time how long you could keep your eyes open, because of the mist and the power of the water. And it was seconds, and then you'd have to close your eyes. So, these stupid games we play. But the falls, so, you have the falls itself, which draws a lot of people, which has a rife history of corruption. I mean, the town of Niagara Falls is so corrupt that their town council, that the state literally said, you can't make any more decisions. Whatever decisions you make, you have to run it by the state first. That's how corrupt Niagara Falls is. And there's an old saying in Buffalo, which is also very corrupt. Well, if you get caught in Buffalo, you can always move to Niagara Falls and still be a politician, which is only 15 miles away. So there's a big history. The mafia was headquartered there. The East Coast Mafia was headquartered there, and FBI did this big raid on them in the 60s, and they were running through the hills, and so it's very mob controlled. There was never an Italian mayor in Niagara Falls until many years ago. A few years ago, because they didn't have to be. There was always Irish mayors because the Italians ran the town. And so they didn't want to have a mayor, didn't look good, things like this. And, completely corrupt. They did something called urban renewal. When I was a kid, there was a beautiful downtown old neon theaters, and I played in all the bars down right near the falls because that was where the clubs were, It was really happening there. And some bright idea, some graft person, decided, let's just tear it all down for urban renewal. But they didn't have any urban renewal. They didn't have any developers to come in. So they just tore it all down, and then nothing happened for years. Things like this. Niagara Falls is really an incredibly weird place. You remember the anthrax scare, right? You remember that,
yeah.
right? Okay, so Niagara Falls, at least at that time, had the most toxic dumps per square foot of any place in the United States. For some reason, everybody came and threw out their crap in Niagara Falls. Well, this is a true story. Now, during the anthrax scare, do you remember Tom Brokaw, the anchor? Well, somebody sent him a letter, and he opened it at his desk, and there was a white powder in it. Okay, now this, and so, of course, everybody jumped up, right? This is, and the dudes came in with the hazmat suits, and, and they pulverized the desk. They had to pulverize his desk. They cleaned it off, and they just pulverized it into right? And that pulverized desk is buried in Niagara Falls. So growing up there, it was bizarre because we were so ancient. Everyone had a car. I had a car when I was 17 years old. My own car. I would work on it every day, just like Frank Zappa and the liner notes to what is it? Is it Weasels Rip? No, not Weasels Rip My Flesh. One of those. The liner notes begin, at 17, Ruben Sano quit school to work on his car. And that's kind of was my life. I worked in my car, I had my girlfriend, and we would just drive around. That's what you did. You drove around, and then, you cruised. It was a cruise culture, probably a lot like California. And you see, I told you this was a long story. I mean, I could go on for hours about it.
I'm sitting, I'm riveted. I have my seatbelt in. I want all of it.
So, it was very, the women, I remember I was so completely unwoke, to use a term, that, when I went to school, I went to the University of Buffalo, which was miles different. It was only 20 miles away, but it was completely different atmosphere than Niagara Falls. It was like you were on another planet. And I saw women who, first off, they were wearing jeans. Women in Niagara Falls didn't wear jeans. They wore dresses. I mean, it was just, and they were protesting, of course, they were out there and I thought, well, why are they protesting? I was just like so incredibly sheltered in this conservative, weird culture. But the thing about it is, the thing I often say is that, Niagara Falls, the falls itself was very powerful thing. Before Robert Moses came in, of course, kicked the Native Americans off their land, put them in trailers, and made the power project. Before that, in the 1800s, before airplanes and amplifiers, Niagara Falls was probably one of the loudest sounds you could hear on the globe. It was literally one of the loudest sounds you could possibly hear. And people would go, when you read things about writers who first encounter Niagara Falls, to a person, they're speechless. It's amazing. Like, I don't know what to say. The literature is filled with these things because it was so incredibly powerful. And I remember being very young, before the Power Project, how loud it was, right? And, it was even wilder before, because in the 1800s there was something called table rock, which was a rock that jutted out from the Canadian side up into all the way across the gorge, like 180 feet down. Imagine this, a slab of rock jutting out towards the falls on the American side, and it stopped like 50 feet, 30 feet from the falls, very close, and people would walk out on this rock and sit on the edge of it for a mystical experience. Until one day, a guy was cleaning his carriage. He was a carriage operator, and he had his horse and his carriage, and he was cleaning his thing, and the rock just snapped in half.
Oh no!
Yeah, he survived, but the carriage did not. Things things like this, right? All sorts of, people going over the falls. Then there was all that, right? People, of course, committing suicide, going over the falls, or just trying to, if you could go over the falls, you could really make a buck, right? If you could survive. So people put themselves in weird, rocket ship things and rubber balls, and most of them died. And there was one guy, Red. What was his name? Red. He was the expert at fishing out the bodies. So, because he knew all the eddies of Niagara Falls. And every time somebody went over, which was often, Red would get the call. He would just sit home and, Red, we got it. He would go out in his boat and he would find them, right? He would, he'd find them. That was Red's job. Yeah. There's hundreds of stories like this. So, but I remember very well as a child in the summertime going to sleep in my bedroom with my window open and hearing the sound of the falls from 35 blocks away. Now, I didn't know what the sound was. It was this, because I didn't realize it was the falls. I was very little. And all I remember was it sounded something like this. It sounded like, this low, it's a sound of something with incredible power, but far away. So it was low because, of course, the bass frequencies travel farther. So it was this low hum that in the day you couldn't really hear because there's cars and everything. But at night, when everything quieted down, there came the sound. So naturally, I just thought, well, whatever, I was just used to that sound. And then one day, I remember very well, we went on a trip. And we went to another city. And we stayed over. And I freaked out because nighttime came and there was no sound. And I was like, wow, where's the sound? And they were like, what do you mean? The sound that comes. And they couldn't. And then they finally figured out. They said, oh, Bobby, that's the falls. I just thought it was the sound the night made. When the night comes, this sound comes. And so I've often thought that had something to do, this low, powerful, my drums are all tuned very low. As older I get, I tune my drums lower and lower. It's kind of like they're just going into the earth, I think that has something to do with it, probably,
I don't like to be reductive on the show, but I do look for precursors in people's lives, right? And I'm like, obviously not everyone that is from Niagara Falls became a drummer and a composer, right? But but if you're attuned in a certain, that's the thing. You had a certain sensitivity to it, and I'm sure that that your brain kind of got trained to that or attuned to that thing in some way.
I think that's right. I mean, I don't know how it couldn't, because it was just pervasive. It was when you live in a little town with a gigantic body of water that's known the world over, and that makes a huge loud sound. I mean, that's what your life is. That's what it is. That's what Niagara Falls, the falls. That we just called the town the Falls. And that's what it was. I mean, there was no other. There was, because of the falls, a ton of chemical plants. That was the other thing about Niagara Falls. It was highly toxic atmosphere. So maybe that's why they decided to bury everything there anyway, because, right? I remember very well, some days you'd go out of your house and your nose would be burning. And I would just say, oh, it's one of those, I didn't know, it's one of those days where your nose burns, DuPont, Occidental Petroleum, they were all there because in the 1800s, they were on the river and they would dump everything right on the Niagara River. And then, finally, the government and environmentalism caught up with that and they moved them to down the river, up the river. And then finally, I guess they did something. But when Robert Moses came in and took a lot of the water from the for the power project. He diverted water, so the falls is kind of a shadow of its former self. In fact, the falls is now on a spigot, and they can turn the falls off and on at will. And every year, I think it's April 15th, when the tourists come back, they turn the falls on exactly, they figured this all out. How much, because they want the right color when it goes over, and no, that's not enough, and too much is a waste of water for the power. So they've got it all figured out, and they just turn the thing to exactly the right thing. And then when the winter comes and the tourists are gone, they turn it back. So much for natural beauty.
If that is not a metaphor for the 20th into the 21st century, I don't know what is.
It's super deep, right? Yeah. Well, that's,
Okay. I have a million questions, but one thing I was thinking of when you were talking is that, like, I think there's something interesting about the fact that, like, that Niagara Falls is a nexus of all these different kinds of things. And my own little, I'm going to say anecdotal, because I don't have any like real evidence about this, but I think the most interesting stuff happens on the edges of where things meet, especially where like different attitudes or different like conceptual schemes or different atmospheres, feelings meet. I think that's where the most interesting whatever happens. And I'm curious, because you had this like very conservative, like the way you described it, even like when you said like the women wore dresses, like I'm thinking like 1910s, 20s, like that kind of conservative kind of feeling, and you're growing up, you're a teenager into your 20s as culture like really shifts. And I'm like you said, when you went to college, you're like, wait, they can wear jeans? Women can wear jeans? Yeah, so you have like this, you have this very conservative feeling. You have this corruption. You have this environmental degradation. And you also have incredible natural beauty, which is, both inspiring and terrifying at the same time. And you have all this stuff existing in one place that you are growing up in.
Exactly. Well, speaking about the edges of things, you know what Napoleon said? Napoleon said, the battle is won or lost in the fold of the map.
Love it. Yeah, it's true.
One of my favorite quotes. Yeah, sure. Because, what is the fold of the map? It's the place of the most uncertainty. Is that no one knows really what goes on in the fold of the map. No one can see it clearly. So, the person that can negotiate uncertainty will win the battle. And I love the idea of the fold of the map, and maybe you're right, no one's ever said that to me, but maybe because of how I was brought up and the weird all the weird contradictions of that place must have done something to me.
Well, I mean, were you aware of it at the time? I've a friend of mine just wrote a book on, he grew up in Hot Springs, Arkansas, which was like this like huge gambling, this very corrupt city. And then by the time he was born, it had all kind of like fallen apart and it was like in disrepair. And, it was like a very weird place to grow up, but he didn't know that until he left it. And he started telling people stories about his town, and they would like look at him with like, eyes open, jaws dropped, tongue falling out. Like, what is going on? Were you kind of
very well?
So you weren't aware of how strange it was while you were in.
No, of course not. I was a kid. You're not aware. You think that that's normal. You think that this is what the world is. Plus, we were very. I was from a very kind of humble, lower middle class Italian family. My father was a factory worker. My mother, of course, did not work, never worked, didn't drive a car, didn't even know how to ride a bicycle, never read a book in her entire life. This is the atmosphere that I grew up in, and my big extended family, but recently I was handed a very thick genealogy that my cousin had made, like of our family from 1860, including every single child and their children. And I mean, it was like thousands of people. And I literally went through this like I don't know, I must have had, nothing to do. And I went through this, and I was the only person in the arts in the entire, from 1860 till now. I was the only person that had chosen the arts as a career. The only crazy person probably. But, all to say, you think this is normal. I thought that this was normal. This is what people did. And I was going to be a dentist. My father wanted me to be a dentist. And I did what my father said. I was going to be a dentist. There was no possible way. And I discovered music, and, I had a big Hendrix poster in my bedroom. And, my father made me take it down. And, like this. And I wanted drums really badly. Oh, you want the story of my first drum set?
Yes. Yes, I read about it on in your bio, and I'm very curious. I have it written down here to ask about it.
Well, there was no possible way that Bobby Previte was going to get a drum set from his parents. First off, everything I had, not to play the violin. I'm playing the violin now. You can't see because it's a podcast, but yeah, indeed, yeah. But I would make things. I made, I played all the sport. I played a lot of sports. So my father's into sports. So I played every single sport in the world, pretty much. And, but I couldn't afford gear. So I had to go and I would go to the Salvation Army and get everything, and I got my golf clubs at the Salvation Army. They were wooden golf clubs, with wooden shafts, and I cut them down because I was so small. I had to make my own handles, and I made everything that I had. And so when I discovered music, because my cousin, who was my father's brother's son, who was younger than me. My father's brother was younger, just younger enough to be like sort of another generation and not as conservative as my father, got him a drum set, a beautiful Slingerland red sparkle drum set. And I went over there and I just looked at this and I just fell in love like instantly. But they wouldn't really let me play because it was like too much, it was too loud or whatever. And then finally they made a deal with me, because my father had gone to barber school, but he hated it. So he never really he graduated, but never became a barber. But because he knew how to cut hair, of course he would cut hair for the whole family, because that's how Italians do it. One hand washes the other. So the deal was when we would go over once a month to cut my cousin's hair, for as long as he was cutting his hair, which was 15 minutes, I could play the drums. And so that was my life. I would wait the whole month for that 15 minutes that I could sit down on a drum set. Because, I was playing on a pad. My cousin had given me a pad. And I was trying to play on a pad, but I didn't have a drum set. So it was ecstatic experience for me to play on a real set. It was just like mind-boggling, right? I loved everything about the drums. I loved the way the cymbals rang and the difference between the cymbals and the tom-toms and the snare. It was because the drums are such a bizarre instrument in the first place. So I decided, well, screw this. I'm going to make a drum set. So I made my own drum set at 13 with garbage cans, and my cymbal stands were plungers, and I had aluminum pie plates nailed to the top of the plungers for my cymbals, and my bass drum was a big metal garbage can, iron garbage can turned out its side, and my snare drum was a box with just a bunch of crap in it that would rattle when I hit it. And I made a bass drum pedal. That was my biggest, invention, out of 2 pieces of linoleum and a coat hanger wound into a spring between them and a rubber ball. I made this, and I played these drums for a year in my basement, like to records, these crazy. And then I started a band, and with those drums, and we would practice in my basement with my stupid homemade drums. And then finally, one of the guys in the band got us a gig. And then they fired me, of course, because I didn't have a drum set. My band. I got fired out of my own band. And that's the day I decided, okay, I'm going to get no one's going to buy me a drum set. I'm going to get my own drum set. So I marched down to the Niagara Falls Gazette. I got a job as a paper boy, and I saved up enough money, and I bought that drum set behind me.
That you still have.
That I still have in my studio, set up my Rogers 1965 Rogers holiday model that are just killer. Of course, I didn't know anything about drum. I didn't know they were killer. I just said, "Well, those look nice. Give me those." Yeah, and that was it. And then the rest was history. I would just practice incessantly in the basement until my father would come home from work, and then the instant my father came home from work, practice was over. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's how I began.
What was it about when you first saw, what was it, your uncle, his drum set? Like, what was it about it that entranced you?
Well, I said the drums are a bizarre instrument. I mean, you have to realize the drum set is not an instrument like most other instruments, and that is not because it doesn't have pitches. Right, because my contention is, pitches or no, the drums are the most, one of the greatest melodic instruments in the world. But that aside, you have to realize that if you look at a piano, it's of a piece. It's one. It's fairly monochromatic in terms of there's all the notes and the different frequencies, but everything's the same. You press a key, that it sort of feels a little bit the same. The mechanism is the same. A lot of the envelope of the sound is the same. Sure, the bass lasts a little longer, but you get what I'm saying. Violin, same thing. But the drums is an invented instrument, invented not as one instrument, but invented from a combination of all these other disparate instruments. The cymbals were an instrument. A snare drum was its own instrument. Tom-toms, its own instrument. So somehow you bring all those other instruments together, right? And you call that it's like a meta instrument, the drum set.
Yeah.
But it's bizarre because it shouldn't even be an instrument. I know there's a drummer joke in there somewhere. But, when you think about how different, what kind of instrument is that when you got metal cymbals from the, Turkey or the Far East that ring, and then you got tom-toms, which kind of, came maybe from Africa, or, snare drum, which is very military, and a hi-hat, which is a completely invented, weird thing. And you got all these things, and you put them together. But not only do you put them together, you go to any piano, a pianist could, they're all sort of the same. Of course, pianists will say, "Oh, that piano I don't like." But drum sets are a function of the drummer. He creates, not only but he creates his own instrument even within that. How many tom-toms do I want? How many cymbals do I want? What kind of cymbals? Where are the cymbals? Where are the tom-toms? Am I going to add a wood block? Maybe a couple cowbells. It's just, it can go on forever, right? You got Terry Bozzio with 100 tom-toms. That's a drum set. Max Roach with 2 tom-toms. That's also a drum set. So just thinking about the drum set in that way it's so strange as an instrument. And the only reason that it became an instrument in the first place was through the playing of all the drummers of the 20th century who played this weird conglomeration of sounds and made it into an instrument of itself, made it into a drum set. And there's a way to play a drum set that is separate from how you play a tom-tom or how a percussionist would play. It's very different. A drummer plays a drum set very differently than a percussionist does, or a percussionist plays a percussion setup. Because really a drum set is just a extended percussion setup. Like if you're playing a piece by Xenakis and he calls for 3 tom-toms, a whistle, that's a percussion setup, you know?
Right.
Right. So there was something about, I think that there was something about the disparateness and the wackiness of that instrument that I loved, because I had played a little guitar, and I love the guitar, but it wasn't for me. I just didn't vibe with it, you know. But the drums were like so crazy. You could hit a cymbal and it just rang, you know, and it just was kind of nuts. And I think that appealed to me, just the weirdo factor.
Yeah. I mean, two things. One is like, there is something about as a guitar or a piano, when I think about playing them, that is linear. I don't really mean that, because I know there's a lot of other things you can do, and I know there's a lot of other ways to play them, but a drum set is not linear, right? It is, and I think that's one of the problems that my brain has playing drums. I can keep time, but I can't really play. To really play drums is to, I mean, there's this, I mean, I don't have to tell you, but like, you know, it's not a linear kind of thing. And
no. It's very circular, actually.
Yeah. I like that. The other thing is, look, I don't want to push this idea too much, so take it with a grain of salt. But again, the drums like that they're in the creases of the map. They take place a drum set takes place at the intersection of all these different percussion instruments, yeah. Right?
And you think about it, you're sitting in the middle, you know, I think it's not called the trap drums for nothing, because you are kind of trapped behind there. And, you know, you're sitting in the middle of these things, and, you know, they're sort of surrounding you. And so, you know, as Billy Hart told me, you know, my good friend, when I was in my 20s, I got a grant from the National Endowment to come to New York to study with him. And I came to New York, and he was like, "What am I going to teach you? I don't know, you already can play. Just hang out with me. Hang out with me for 3 weeks, Previte." And we just hung out. He had a gig every night, of course. He's Billy Hart. And we would just drive to all his gigs. But he did teach me a lot, and on a, you know, kind of another level. And I remember him telling me, as a drummer, you have to hear beyond, you have to have the visual image that you're not behind the drums. You're in front of the band and you're listening backwards, because otherwise you'll never get out, because the drums are so circular. And I remember the reason I wanted to study with him was he came to Buffalo with Herbie Hancock's Mwandishi band. And I heard that band in a little club, and it was totally life-changing. And at that point, I had been a very linear drummer. I mean, very directional. Like, I felt directional. Like, here's the ride cymbal, and it's to my right, and it does this. And then, you know, my left hand only does, you know. And when I saw Billy play, he played in the set was open to his whole body. And he was in the middle of it, and he was completely open. And I realized that, no, it's not like you've been playing, Bobby. It's a circle. It's a circle. And that changed my playing forever, seeing him play.
Do you think that was the thing? So, I mean, was it just a gradual kind of transformation coming out of this like very conservative town? Or was it like, because I'm trying to think, like, was it when you went to college Was it when you moved to New York? Like where do you start to like leave this kind of conservatism behind?
Immediately.
So Buffalo.
As soon as I got to the University of Buffalo, which was at that time called the Berkeley of the East, because it was a very radical school, that it was over. I was just like, I was all in, all in with the program. I was just like, I'm down with this, And in my freshman year, we completely shut the school down. The administration building, we burned the administration. It was crazy, riot police on campus. I was completely radicalized. You couldn't walk through the student union in the University of Buffalo without somebody, some upper class person, stopping you and engaging in a political conversation. Like literally, like I remember very well, because they knew you were a freshman and a dopey freshman. And I remember very well these two guys, and they accosted me, and we were talking, and they were arguing, and I said something finally like, well, if you don't like what's going on now, you can vote them out, or well, you can vote. It's a funny thing to say now with the election so far away. And they burst out laughing. Uproarious laughter. And they walked away, like doubled over, walked away. And then I looked at them astonished, and then they turned around 20 feet away from me and through their laughter said, you mean you actually think that when you pull the lever, something happens? And I just thought it was great because it made me think, like, well, I don't know. I should think about that. Does something happen? I was so trusting. I think that's what it did for me. It made me more more of a skeptic, not a cynic, but a skeptic. A skeptic just questions. It made me question things a lot more. And it was really weird because when I went to the University of Buffalo, I went there to become a dentist, and then my father died fairly early. Fairly young. He died actually when I was a senior in high school, but I went to college and I still was going to be a dentist because I was honoring my father, and but I was miserable. I didn't want to be a dentist, Nothing with dentists. Any dentist looking, I have a very fine dentist who happens also to be a great pianist. He's really cool. But I didn't want to be a dentist. But I was in pre-dent, with a lot of math, science. And I would wander into the music department at the University of Buffalo. And little did I know that because I went to the University of Buffalo because it was close to home. I couldn't really afford to go away to college. It was cheap. It was a state school, and I had a scholarship, and that was the only reason I went. I didn't even apply anywhere else. That was the only possibility for me. But little did I know, in a weird circumstance, actually the universe decided that was exactly the right place for me to be. The music department at the University of Buffalo, at that moment, had a department that Lucas Foss created with money from the Rockefeller Foundation, and he had money to bring in the giants of new music at the time. So John Cage taught there. He was there. I used to see him in the hall. I didn't know who he was. I thought he was just a weird guy. I would pass, who's that weird guy? Lucas Foss, Xenakis came through, Steve Reich, Pauline Oliveros came through. I played a couple of her pieces when I was in percussion school. Jan Williams, my percussion instructor, was the percussionist on Terry Riley's In C on the record. He was first call percussionist for Morton Feldman. Morton Feldman was there. He taught there. So they were all there. Weirdly, in Buffalo, they were all there. I had no idea. Of course, I didn't even know anything about who Beethoven was. I was a kid that played R&B and soul and rock. Maybe a little jazz. I didn't know. And they were all there. And I just would go to the music department, and I would go to these concerts where they would be doing just like crazy 20th century music, and I had no ground to even try to understand, or I had no point of reference for this, and I was just mystified. And then as time went on, I just went there more and more, and I just thought, gee, I want to be a music major. I don't want to be a dentist. And, I finally, I said, I'm sorry, Dad, but, I'm going to try to be a music major. Of course, like, not having ever studied music, ever. So I was very, very at a disadvantage. But somehow my teacher, Jan Williams, took me as a student. I don't know why. And, then that was it. Then I found out who John Cage was, and who Morton Feldman was. And I learned that whole repertoire. And at the same moment, I learned all of jazz. So all those things converged at once. Monk, Varese, rock music. It was just all kind of a jumble in there, and then I guess also Niagara Falls.
I mean, look, you are a likable and charismatic person, so I can understand why. And you have these kind of like, again, what I'm saying, like these precursors, right? You have this kind of like, you're a hard worker, obviously. You create, when you couldn't have your own drum set, you created your own drum set. And I think that probably like that set off something in my brain where I'm like, oh, well, like, the history of 20th century, like modern composition or something is the idea of like creating new forms out of this old, I don't know the theory necessarily. I just know that I enjoy it. So you can tell me how like off I am, but the idea of like, taking the, like I think about the 12-tone scale or something like, hey, we're going to create our own, something new out of this fundament. So, I mean, you have all these like pieces that are there.
Yeah, but I must say it's becoming more and more difficult for anyone who is coming from a background such as mine to be in the arts. Yeah. It's because it's so, there's just so little remuneration in it, and it's such a tough road. You almost have to, a lot of people who succeed now and are in the arts are people that do have some means behind them. It's just a fact. It's very difficult. So it's funny when I'm teaching a master class, or, I teach this class twice a year. Now it's online, my improvisation workshop. I'm doing another one in January. It's a 4-day intensive. Because I like to teach improvisation because, I teach it in a different way. I talk about painting. I talk about all these different things. When I get a student in a master class, I go to a college or something, and they're all sitting there with their instruments, and I tell them this story, maybe, if it comes up, of me making my own drum set. They're just like, I can tell, they're just, what? They can't even process that. Andrew, because their parents are paying $50,000 a year for them to study music, and they've got all their instruments, and they're really nice instruments, and they were bought. Really, that's the reality. No one's a paper boy getting his saxophone, who are going to these schools. So it's kind of hilarious when I encounter someone who isn't motivated. I'm like, okay, no patience for that. Sorry. If you aren't motivated, next.
Yeah, totally. Did you find? I definitely. I came from a pretty solid middle class background. I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and I coming into like the world of like writing and performing, I do feel a little out of place sometimes in these kind of like very elite areas where people come from very wealthy backgrounds. Did you have that same kind of like feeling?
Absolutely. Yeah. I always kind of felt like a bit of an imposter, or, I mean, I didn't even understand at first. I was sort of like, as I said, you only know one thing, where you came from. And where I came from was so hermetically sealed. There weren't even any people with means there, really, any real means. When I got to New York, I saw real wealth. And I was so naive that I didn't think that anybody in my scene, especially, or anybody who was a musician, had real wealth other than music. So sometimes I saw, like, a compatriot of mine, like buy a brownstone or something, and I would go, what? Wow, like, how'd they do that? Like, I have the same gigs they do. And I understood. But it's cool, for years I had the self-made person disease, which is, difficult to eradicate. You do things like this, and, okay, no one's, when I watched my band go to the gig, I sat on the street corner and watched them take their gear to the gig all day, and I was fired, and I said to myself, okay, no one's going to help me. No one's going to help me. I have to do this all myself. Well, that's very, while maybe it was somewhat true for me, it's very dangerous, because you get this mindset that, everybody has to do it that way, and that's not true. No one has to do anything any particular way. And for years, I was jealous and resentful. I kept it back, but I was jealous and resentful of people whose parents, gave them $100,000 to start a record company or whatever they did, and now, I had to work on that, and I had to say, no, that's cool, great, you go ahead on. I wish that had happened to me, good for you. If you do something with it, it all depends what you do with it. But it can be a dangerous path,
Oh yeah. Oh no, definitely. I mean, I've been in therapy for years now. I'm just dealing with some of the resentment issues alone.
Yeah. It's hard, and but it's tough life, and everybody's life is tough, and everybody's going to perish, and everybody carries that with them, no matter how much money or fame or whatever they have that you think you might want to have. You realize that underneath it all, it doesn't really matter, and the things that really matter, and you find out, and everyone knows what really matters. It's just really structuring your life to make sure that those things come to the fore. I don't think you don't have to tell anybody what really matters in this life. Everyone knows, but we just forget, or we're distracted. And I think, it's a beautiful endeavor. Good for you. That's what you should be doing.
Yeah. I love this. Heidegger has a term, I think it's, I forget the German, but it's like called being towards death. And where you're like, when you have the horizon of your life in mind, right? You act in a certain way, but then you forget about it, and you just go about playing a game on your phone or like goofing off or something like that. And then you remember again. You're like, oh right, I have to do something for real, because there's a end point for all of this. And you just keep, it's like this dialectic. You just keep moving back and forth between those things, and hopefully you spend more time in the parts where you're like, oh right, there's an expiration date for me. I'm going to do meaningful things.
And that was before Twitter. Isn't Heidegger canceled, by the way? I don't know.
It's interesting. When I was studying philosophy, All the professors who had made their bones on Heidegger were trying to like really downplay the fact that he was a Nazi and like be like, oh, but everyone had to be a Nazi to teach that. And like as a student, I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I get that. And then you think about it for a second, you're like, well, he didn't have to teach. He could have been like, I don't want to align myself with the this genocidal lunatic. I can just not teach and fight against them. I'm like, oh,
it's the old just doing their job.
And there's been a resurgence, I think, in the last couple years, maybe, that are like of people who are like, let's actually look at his philosophy and pick out what parts are kind of like actually Nazi-ish, because he really was a Nazi, and so that's probably in his philosophy, and I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Well, I do feel like, bad people or whatever one want to call it can create good things and beautiful things. And, what I mean,
yes,
that the history of mankind is replete with, those examples, and vice versa, by the way.
Yeah. No. Yes. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in Heidegger. You just have to like read it with that with that filter, or not that filter, with like taking out the filter, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's important to know.
Yes.
It's very important to know people's history, and yes, very, very important to know.
We're right at the end of the show. I just had kind of one more question, because you come to New York in 1979, right? Mm-hmm. Is that when you moved there?
Yes.
And were you already kind of like, did you already have your own style and your own way of playing, your own way of composing at that point? Because I think of 1979 in my mind is, I lived in New York for 10 years, from like 2008 to about 2017. And by that time, New York was like kind of cleaned up. And but in my mind, I had this very romantic version of like the late 70s New York in my head. And that's what I had always wanted to do. Like live in that, and like this kind of like this dirty and disgusting, but also like this wonderful place where all this amazing art happens.
Absolutely true.
Did that like, were you already like a complete person, or do you think that like that, and also how much of that romantic vision in my head is realistic?
It's very realistic. It was great. I mean, what can I say? It was great. I had the time of my life. I mean, it was an amazing experience. Meeting all the people I met, jumping in. I mean, yes, I was my own person, but it was validated big time in New York. So I had all these feelings, but in Buffalo, I couldn't really do them, but all of a sudden I went to New York, and here were people that were doing those things. And so it was supreme validation. And I just jumped feet first in, I'm in, all in. And it was great. There were so many places to play. I played all the time. Did we make a lot of money? No, but my rent was $200, you'd make $25 or $50 on a gig, you had a quarter of your rent. Well, think about that now. If your rent is $2,000, what gig in Manhattan you're going to get some stupid little gig for $500? You're not, right? So I feel so badly for the younger musicians. It's just like, it's impossible. And it wasn't impossible for us. So since that was the structure, you could try so many things. If you failed, so what? Next week you do something different in a different place. There was like all the time things were, I saw and heard so many things, and there was so many different scenes going on, and my mind was just completely blown. Playing at CBGB and Tramps and the Danceteria and the Mud Club, with the garage door in front of the stage, it would come up. It's like the garage door was down. You would set up. You couldn't see anybody, and gigs then would start like at 3 a.m. We'd start. Our gig would start at 3 on a Tuesday night, and I would go like, who in the world is going to be watching this gig? And then the garage door would come up, and it would be packed with people. It was just a totally different era, and it was great. I was very, very fortunate. Very fortunate. I always feel like I got in just before my personal door closed, because I wanted to come. I was afraid to come. I wanted to come. All my friends didn't want to go because they were too afraid to, and they were like afraid for me, and they were like, for many reasons. New York was a dangerous place then, more. The best musicians in the world were there. I thought I was going to go, and a week later I was just going to get burned to the ground. I just going to go home because I can't play. And of course there were musicians on another level, but there were plenty of musicians that, there's a lot of people, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of people. So I felt like the last possible moment for me. I just said, no, I have to go. And I didn't know anybody but Elliot Sharp. And he took me in. And through Elliot, I met the downtown scene. And that just happened to be the correct scene for me, because it also intersected with the jazz scene, but the kind of avant jazz scene, which was loft jazz had just ended, downtown music began, and I landed. So I was very lucky.
I mean, what was it that you were able to get over that fear? Like, was it just like pure will? Like, I have to do this? Or was there some kind of like argument you had in your head that like convinced you?
Well, I'm sure it was another fear. I was more afraid of not going and then telling myself my whole life that I didn't go.
Yes.
And I was more afraid that I was going to end up working, in a factory, or I was just going to have I was more afraid of that than of New York. And that's saying something because I was really quite nervous about moving to New York. I didn't have a place to stay. I just went there, and I put all my stuff in my 65 Ford Mustang, and I drove to New York, and my muffler fell off in the middle of the Holland Tunnel, and I got there, and at rush hour, I emerged on Canal Street with 20 billion people, and I was used to having for $150 a month a house, a whole house I was renting in Buffalo with a sun porch and a garage, it was freaky. So I was quite nervous and quite scared, but it all worked out. New York actually ended up saving my life.
Do you mean that literally, or do you just mean that like, because I identify with that so much that the vision of me just ending up not doing the thing I wanted to do in life was the fear of like being that person was so powerful that it overcame all my other fears.
Exactly. I mean, yeah, I don't know what would have happened to me without music and without New York. I was lucky enough to find music, but what would have happened with my kind of sensibility and what I wanted to do had I not gone to New York? How could I have done? Well, I never would have done any of the things I did, of course, and I could argue with myself all day long whether those things were worthwhile or not, or, whether they're worthwhile to the world or not. But one thing I know is I never would have done them. There would have been no Empty Suits or Weather Clear Track Fast or Music of the Moscow Circus or, Mass or Bump the Renaissance. I never would have met Steve Swallow. None of that stuff would have ever happened to me. And so I feel quite lucky. It's talking about it almost brings me back to those times when I would feel like this energy. You can feed off fear too, and anxious. You can feed off that, and I did. I felt off that kind of the moment, like I'm here, and damn it, I better I better do something because I don't want to leave. Now that I'm here, I certainly don't want to go back. That was even worse than never having gone, right?
Yeah.
You can't go back, so it's like, well, I couldn't anyway. So I felt like it's not possible. It's not possible. I have to go on. I have to swim to the other shore. I'm in the middle of this lake. I cannot go back. I have to keep going. Even though, you swim out, you know what's behind you. You don't know what's ahead of you in the water, but it wasn't any kind of courage or any silly things like that. It was just fear.
Oh, Bobby, you're speaking directly to my heart. This is oh my God. I can't thank you enough for doing this.
Oh, it's fun, man. A lot of fun.
This is so wonderful.
It's a good idea for a podcast. My wife Andrew, who's very, she's I won't say she's hypercritical, but she sometimes can be. And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this podcast," and I said, said, "What is it?" I told her what the idea was about, and she said, "Oh, that's a good idea for a podcast."
Yeah, I think I think honestly, this stuff, like, it really explains, rather than like if I asked you, like, why did you write something? Like, why did you make this composition?
It's like a dumb question anyway, and no one wants to answer.
Yeah. Because I know from making things that I'm like, I don't know. I felt it. Like, it's a lot of it's a bodily feeling for me when I create.
Right. There's no why exactly. But it's good. Like, I touch upon my beginnings in interviews sometimes, but, never, it's usually not mostly about that. And it was quite a journey for me.
Oh, I'm really glad. I'm really glad we could talk.
So
really thanks so much. Have a great night.
All right, you too, man.
All right, see ya.
Bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye, oh, bye.